for you.
Welcome. Please come on in. Have a seat. Yeah, thank you for coming. I am Ula Polsky. I'm the Director of Partnerships here at the Rue Institute. Today we're celebrating our 3rd birthday, and I've been here for almost that whole time before the Institute for Experiential AI was even established. I'm delighted by the growth and change and partnership that we've seen over the years. I see my friend David Messenger from Sun Life in the back, and he was here at the beginning with us as well. So welcome to this fantastic panel on ethical and regulatory challenges ahead in AI. We heard a lot this morning from our CEO panelists and others about data privacy, about compliance, and all the things that are really critical to how we all work and do things in a way that we're going to be proud of going forward. So I wanted to introduce you to our moderator today. I'm thrilled you joined the Institute for Experiential AI. Cansu is the ethics lead for the Institute of Experiential AI, and she's also an associate research professor. She's also the AI ethics consultant for the UN and Interpol, and is a former Intel analyst. I'm happy about that too. So I'm going to turn things over to Cansu and take it away.
Thank you. It's amazing to see all of you joining, and I have also awesome panel with me. So I'm going to do very short introductions, and I've said this before to the panel, but I'm going to say it in front of you as well. So I have questions that I prepared, but I don't care about those questions. I'm going to use them, but just help, jump in, make this like a good conversation, and you guys, same goes for yourself. Just jump in when the audience question starts, and we can have it like a lively discussion rather than very structured, boring panel, because the topic is not boring. Okay, so starting with Fernando Nascimento. Okay. Assistant professor in digital and computational studies at Bowdoin. Before he joined Bowdoin, he worked in software research and development for 20 years. So I can say you're a philosopher and software engineer, right? That's right. Okay. Lucas Ives, okay, computer scientist?
Yep.
Is that the right? Okay. Engineering manager in Apple's AI and machine learning division, working on Siri, as we were discussing before we started. Rita Heimes, is that the right way to say it? Okay. I'm asking this all the time because my name is horrible, so I am always worried about it. General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer at International Association of Privacy Professionals. And prior to that, she was a law professor and academic dean at the University of Maine School of Law. She directed the Center for Law and Innovation. And Grayson Lookner, Maine State Representative and serving his 2nd term. And he serves on Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee and Joint Select Committee on Housing. And we will talk about the facial recognition question that the question and eventually the bill that passed in May. All right, so to kick things off, so I'm a philosopher myself. I'm going to start the conversation with the philosophy question. I'm being biased on that one. So, Fernando, so my first question is for you. So how do we define AI ethics and responsible AI? What is its scope and its goal? So, and here what I really want to sort of clarify is when we talk about AI ethics, it sounds very vague, it sounds very intuition-based. People generally say, well, it's your moral compass. We never know, it depends. And if so, how can we even think about systematizing it or operationalizing it in practice? So, is it so?
Can you hear me? Yeah. So, well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm amazed by the audience to an ethics conversation. So this is really great. Thank you. If you ask the same question to 10 different ethicists, you're going to get 10 different answers, because it depends on the framework in which you operate to answer the question about ethics. So I'm going to use mine. To me, ethics is the discourse on how we can make decisions and actions to foster flourishing human lives. Let's That's how I see what we should do when we talk about ethics. Oh, if that's the case, AI, and by the way, there are two sides of this story. One is, what should you do to not destroy this flourishing right away? It's a negative approach to this question of the flourishing life. I think that in AI, and it's very important that we do that, but in AI ethics, we have been focusing more on this negative approach. How we don't destroy flourishing lives through AI, which is great. But the focus, I think, should have been expanded, and that's the invitation for all of us, to consider the positive side of that. So how can we frame AI projects, AI questions, in order for them to, from the very beginning, from the very inception, be tailored to this objective of fostering a good life, flourishing life to human beings. Now, obviously, if this sounds obvious to you, take a look again at how AI has been used in the last 10 years or 2 decades. And you're going to notice that it might not be the main driver of how AI has been developed, organized, and deployed. So hopefully that's a starting point for our conversation.
That's a good starting point. I think to that point, one thing that sometimes the phrases AI for good and good AI are used. I think, AI for good is specifically talking to that opportunity that you are referring to, right? Like, what can we do so that AI systems are actually making our lives better? And we know that we have so many ethical issues in our lives already in the systems that we live in. Can we use AI systems to make it better? Versus good AI, which also we desperately need, but trying to make sure that we get the risks out of the way. Yeah. Thinking if I should continue. Well, let me just ask you one more follow-up before I move on. But so, how do you think that this way of thinking about human flourishing and integrating this mentality from the very beginning to the project, how would you say this takes form in practice, or how should it take form in practice?
Great. This is a fantastic question. So that's very nice from the theoretical standpoint. But how can you make it real? And I think that there are a few frameworks that can be used. One of them is called the capabilities approach. It was proposed by Amartya Sen 20 years ago. He won the economic Nobel Prize, by the way, the Nobel Prize in economics. And it frames a set of areas in which we could act to enhance the capabilities of people. And I think that it provides the framework to answer the question, how do we frame AI in an ethical way? So I think it's a very pragmatic starting point if you want to pick one possibility. There are others, but I think that this one fits quite well with this positive take on AI.
Thank you. And Rita, so moving from ethics to law, how do law and regulations come into play in this? So, there's always this saying that regulation is trying to play catch up with technology, and it's never going to be on time. It's always going to be, we're always going to have these huge gaps between when the regulation comes in and what technology does. So what should be the goal and process of regulation so that we can ensure some sort of protection, at least from the harmful technologies? So focusing on the risk part, from the harmful technologies as they are getting developed and deployed.
Well, thank you for having me. Is this on? We've been
We're
on and on, and it seems to be doing the same thing either way. So fortunately, as a former law professor, I know how to project without a mic. May I take just a minute to say that the International Association of Privacy Professionals, which may or may not be familiar to you, is a membership association for privacy professionals. So we organize events and produce content to help people in the field of privacy work with organizations toward using good privacy practices, and complying with privacy regulations. So what I love about the way we're seated is it seems to me that this is in fact the way law often progresses. It starts with philosophy and ethics. It moves to people. Also, by the way, it usually pauses at the point of civil society coming up with frameworks and guidelines. You know, the OECD, for example, had fair information practice
And he
principles.
invited.
Yes.
It was there
Right,
was
brilliant.
chair.
You know, it comes up with practices and principles. Sometimes standards organizations gets involved. You have an ISO or an IEEE. They'll come up with standards and frameworks. Human beings, in the form of professionals, insert themselves in organizations and help establish and maintain these frameworks. And then sometimes it's not enough, right? It doesn't quite work. Society's feeling uncomfortable, and we end up with law. And then the same people who were trying to help the frameworks now interpret the law, and we go to another level. And the beauty of law, I suppose, is that now you have accountability and enforceability in ways that just frameworks, they're nice, but they're voluntary. And so, so that's, I think, just to set the stage, that's where we go. And do we need law? Well, we can talk about that, but I just wanted to say that for the moment and then let you ask the next one.
Oh, should I ask you the same?
Do we need law? Are you asking that?
Well, I mean, how do you think that how should be the process of law? Because
Okay.
there is this issue, right? Like, if
Yes.
you, okay, let me sort of like expand on that a little bit. If you try to be too ambitious and put on the regulation too fast, there is a high chance that the regulation will overdo or try to do things that are actually detrimental, not just for technology, innovation, and so on, but also detrimental for the purpose of the regulation. So if you are, for example, trying to deal with biases, but then you put in place regulations in such a way that you cannot anymore test for biases, well, that's an issue, right? So there's a good reason to not act too fast. But then if you don't act too fast, you will have all these scandals and issues and people will get harmed. So how should we think about law's speed? What should be the regulatory speed?
Could you actually use the microphone?
Sure.
Yeah, and just flip it on
For
for the online participant.
Yeah, I mean, it still says on, so I'm happy to do it. Yeah, if you're saying it may not amplify
Good
my
try.
voice. Okay. Well,
What we're seeing, whether it's
wow.
whether it's the right way or wrong way, what we're seeing, and I think privacy law is an ideal example of what may happen if we get more and more specific regulation around AI. What we're seeing is, let's just take the United States, for example. The United States started off regulating the use of personal data by industry. So it would say, oh, we know health data is something we care a lot about. Let's regulate the use of health data. Financial data, we're going to regulate that. Children is a subset of society. We're going to regulate data with regards to these particular sectors of society. And that was our approach to it, and perhaps facial recognition is a flavor of AI that we're most worried about now. So we'll just start there. Simple, it's important, it's modern, it's timely. But it's just that. It's not AI writ large, it's just this one particular use that scares us or that we think could be harmful. Eventually, we make it a more comprehensive regulatory regime. If you just take privacy again as an example, we have European General Data Protection Regulation, which just says it's personal data. I don't care what kind. It relates to a human being, so it's regulated if it's collected from a European. California borrowed the same model. If the data could be used to identify a human, it's personal data, you have to treat it with this regulatory framework. So that's where it's great if it's generic, and you can get guidelines from regulators helping you to interpret it. You can, of course, get cases where people cross the line and you find out later, oops, we shouldn't have done it that way because we got fined or we were sued. But eventually coming up with a general framework is well, they're doing it. Europe is about to pass an artificial intelligence act. Brazil has one, Canada's working on one. So you could say what's best or what's not best, but it is happening, and I think the struggle is to come up with risk-based approaches to protect against the worst things that could happen to human beings, the worst things that could happen to society at large, and then encourage people to avoid those things and put in accountability mechanisms. There will be a lot of non-compliance,
that's the way it goes, but hopefully the big cases that get everyone's attention will cause downstream compliance of the smaller enterprises who are just either willing to do the right thing or fearful of the outcomes.
Well, actually, yes.
Can I get rid of this?
You can get rid of this because I think this is like a natural way to ask the next question. So, having been through the process of passing a law related to technology, can you tell us how did that process been? What were the challenges? Where did the pushback come from? Who were your supporters? So just if you could give us a good explanation and a picture of how it actually happened.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's an honor to be included on this panel. In preparation, I did the only sensible thing for this panel, and I asked ChatGPT how we should regulate artificial intelligence, which is honestly, I think, how a lot of legislation works, is that we ask the industry how they should regulate themselves. It's one of the points Rita was just making, I think, about, and that you were saying as far as how fast regulation should catch up. In my mind, it's actually really great that we're sitting here because right across the street here is some of the last low-income housing on the peninsula in Portland. And I'm proud of that. So Munjoy Hill has been a very rapidly developing area. And one of the reasons, we talk about housing prices and unlivability and people getting forced out. And it's so awesome to have, something like the Rue Institute coming to Portland, and this energy here is just incredible. But one of the things about regulation is the proliferation of short-term rentals. This might not ingratiate me to, a number of tech people here, but I assume everybody here is. But so Airbnb, for instance, 9% or something of the rental housing in this area of Portland is now in short-term rental, and that was something that, in my mind, the city didn't get ahead of. The state hasn't really gotten a handle of, and it's forcing up housing prices and that sort of commodification. So that's one point I wanted to talk to. To your question about facial recognition technology, so the law actually it came together really well. Maybe folks here aren't familiar with all the problems around facial recognition technology, but in all of AI, it's designed by people who look like me, look like the folks sitting up here, misidentifies people of color, misidentifies women. It's querying. That's a tech word, right? Querying. The data sets. The data set that we give it, and it's often very, it misidentifies people, and there have been false arrests based on that. So the bill that I helped craft with the ACLU, we came together with the Maine State Police. Not often that you get those two interests working together. But we came up with a bill that everybody could agree on, and it was unanimous except for the sheriffs for some reason. But it worked out really well. So Maine has the most comprehensive regulation around the use by public entities of facial recognition technology. You have to have a warrant to be able to use it in most instances. State agencies, they were mandating that you had to use facial surveillance for access to unemployment benefits for some unknown reason, and that we could use any private database. So there are all these sort of unscrupulous private databases out there. Am I talking about one?
No. Technology is not our friend.
Yeah, so I have this.
Oh, wow.
Great. So I have to start over. So using these private databases that perhaps aren't they're using people's data against without their consent, not giving anything back, and that to me is really problematic. An invasion of privacy, an invasion of civil liberties. And I don't think that the public sphere is the only sphere that ought to be regulated. I think there ought to be more regulation in the private industry. Again, something that maybe won't ingratiate me to a number of people here. But I think that's where we need to go. And that bill came together because we were able to, have a real conversation and bring these different interests together. And I think it's kind of rare in this day and age to have that sort of police working with civil liberties, working with, and it came together and it passed. And I'm really proud that Maine has the most comprehensive regulation of facial surveillance of any state in the country.
I have more questions, but you just gave a very good segue to move to Lucas, so I'm just going to hold those other questions for now. But so this private-public relation, which is getting more and more blurry because a lot of the public sector is not developing their own technologies. Instead, they are relying on the private sector to develop them, and then they collaborate. Sometimes it's with the exact same purpose that is stated. Sometimes it's sort of like, well, it can serve to this purpose, but we could also use it for other things, like visual recognition. We can use it for search and rescue, but we can also use it for targeting. I mean, you don't have to specify that to that level, perhaps. So how do you think that AI ethics and regulation should come into private sector, should be integrated, or how should the private sector relate to AI ethics and regulation? And also, how do you think private sector is a player in the ethics and regulation game, or should be?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that a lot of it's coming out of the private sector right now, I think was spoken to by the CEO panel earlier, which is right now you need a ton of compute, and you need some giant data sets, which are not cheap to acquire. And maybe you need some lawyers with, maybe you need some deep pockets and a crack staff of lawyers in order to collect that data that you need to collect. That will change. I'm going to take my big co hat off for a second and just speak as a technologist. Moore's law is still in effect. We seem to be driving things that once seemed like science fiction to commodity. One that's really related to a lot of what we do in AI these days is speech recognition. I work on Siri. Speech recognition is a big part of what we do. Back in 2010 or so, I think Siri was born at SRI in like 2011, but 2010, companies like Nuance were doing speech recognition poorly. Not that they were doing a bad job, but like what was state of the art then versus what was state of the art today was not great, and they were charging a lot for it. It is basically free now. And so anybody can go out there and, especially for Native American English speakers, we're, better than human at, and I'm not talking we Apple, I just mean like the human race has computers now that are better than human at understanding what humans say. We'll get to all languages eventually. It's just a data problem. What should the private sector do, right? I work for a company that is notoriously secretive, right? They're, rooms with like things covered in black cloth and nobody knows what other people work on. That's the public perception. It's not actually true internally, especially if you're on the software side. If you're on the hardware side at Apple, you're building our flying skateboard or whatever we're building. Yeah, you probably won't know too much about that unless you're on that project. But on the software side, it's a software gig like a lot of other places. In ML in particular, we are trying to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and contribute back to the research community, because these techniques have been known for a little while, but the technology being good enough for purpose is very recent, which is why you see this hockey stick shaped curve in all the stuff that's coming out. It's like, okay, first we had some like weird like text generation, and then all of a sudden DALL-E's on the scene and like creating crazy images. And like you get into the ethics argument of like who owns those images. Like if a painter learns to paint in an impressionistic style, they've been studying the impressionists and taking that in and then creating something. Well, a computer effectively did the same thing, except it just did it with the sum total of all art created by humans, like since people started recording art. So like really interesting ethical questions there. The private sector is trying to make money. We do in very... We do, in very different ways though. One of the reasons I like working at Apple is like I'm trying to sell you a phone, and like once you bought the phone, like we're good. I'm not interested in like monetizing your personal data. Other companies have a very different business model, and this is not a judgment, but it is just, it is. And so to your point, to search and rescue versus search and pick a different verb that's maybe a little more malevolent, there's some real questions there. And I have a past life building technology for kids, and so we ran right into COPPA and found that that regulation had been crafted without the FTC actually understanding what it meant. And so we marched ourselves to Capitol Hill and was like, by the way, you've contradicted yourself in like these 8 ways, and there's a real gray area here. And you need to reconcile that. So I think one of the things that private sector could do is help the education pass for the folks that are actually building the policy, because these technologies have gotten to the point where these models that are being built, right? You hear about these models that took this many hours to train and this many GPU hours and blah, 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 blah. They are so far beyond the ability of a human to comprehend how if I poke over here, something over here happens, that if your job is a policymaker or you're a career politician or you're in it on that side, you need help. It's not because you're not capable of understanding it, but it's just so different than anything we've done before. And so I think the private sector could really be doing more in the education space. I don't mean the lobbying space.
Yeah.
Again, this is me with my private citizen hat on and my corporation hat off. But if you're going to regulate this stuff, which I think is important, you need to understand it. And every time I hear a soundbite on CNN or read something on the front page of the Times that I happen to know a lot about, it's like, ooh, there's some pretty fundamental misconceptions about what's going on here. I'll stop there.
Okay, so again, of course I have more questions, but so I think now let's turn to the audience questions so that we have enough time for you guys to ask your questions.
Yeah.
You can probably hear me. I do a lot of public
we have some
speaking.
folks online.
Online, yeah.
I'm sorry.
We need your.
I think it's interesting, your last example, when you say something happened here and something happened over there, as it relates to human interaction for banking, finance, credit, etc. China has a single number that determines your whole life as it relates to your credit, what you can do in society, where you're striving, etc. We have credit scores and so on. But you can't explain, if you can't explain the number to a person, how you got from here to here, that's an ethical dilemma to me. I don't understand how we're going to deal with that situation. You can't explain to another individual how you got to that conclusion. I'm happy to have that happen with my drugs. You need to take this one, but I'm not so happy about that when I can't get a car loan.
You're happy with it with the drugs?
If they can tell me this particular drug treats my cancer because of an AI model, I like that, right? Because that's a benefit to me. But if they can't tell me why I can't get a loan, that's a different problem.
What if they can tell you that you get a loan? Do you still poke around, or are you happy now?
Absolutely not.
That's what you keep you happy.
It was just an example.
Yeah. You might
Sorry.
talking to a pharmacologist, you might be shocked to hear that we actually have no idea why a lot of drugs work at all. These are large, complex systems, and we found out that we can do certain things with them. There's also ways that they behave that we haven't quite wrapped ourselves around yet. That doesn't mean we won't eventually. But I guess the idea around we talked about some of the regulation about right to be forgotten. Okay, so if you decide to opt, if you decide to opt out of some data model, right, and that changes the behavior of that data model, then what do we do, right? That's a tech problem we have to solve. Because yesterday we were getting answer A, today, because your info was pulled out, we're getting answer B. And there's a lot of different ways to look at that from a corporate perspective, maybe we're getting a worse answer and our users are unhappy. Or maybe we're suddenly getting a better answer because of reasons, right? And yeah, it's a really hard problem.
Yeah, of course.
So just want to say that there's probably one difference with AI. If you ask your doctor, why are you prescribing this medicine to me? He can answer to you, I know why, but if I try to explain to you, you have to go to the medical school, right? So it's okay. The problem with AI in many cases is if you ask to the engineer who created the system, why is it behaving that way? Not even the engineer can answer it. So there is a level of unknown that is different in scale because AI has more agency. And then in ethical terms, we call it this problem of explainability. The issue is the more you ask the system to explain itself, the worse it performs. So this is the trade-off that has been discussed these days.
I'm also gonna respond. But I mean, I want to sort of like challenge you both in a way because I think there is more understanding in pharma, for example, because we do these clinical trials. Yes, the clinical trials don't give you all the drug interactions in most cases, and yes, they tend to usually exclude women and children. So yes, there is a lot of gray area, but we try to understand how it works through clinical trials. And we get a pretty good sense, not a great sense, but pretty good sense. Well, on the other hand, so I'm sort of disagreeing with the level of opacity on the pharma side that you pose, but I'm also disagreeing with you that the doctors really know, because usually, I think doctors are like active, like the way that they are formulating their opinions are very similar to an AI system in a way, because there's a lot of intuition. There's a lot of, I've seen so many cases, my sense is that this is going to work better for you. None of the guidelines actually say that, but I don't have an evidence against that, so I'm just going to go with this. And when you ask them, which happened, I worked in bioethics and medical ethics for a long time, for over a decade, and I worked with doctors as well. And it's so fascinating that like in the morning I teach informed consent, in the evening there's a health event that happens, and I ask the doctor, can you tell me the risk of each procedure? And they'll be like, well, like let's say one is 20%, the other is 30%. And I'm like, where do you get these numbers? Well, you know, like, kind of. How informed consent works. And it happens so many times. Just recently again, like a couple of weeks ago, happened here as well. Not here, in Boston. Maybe here it's like so much better, I don't know. But, so, I don't know. Like, I'm not sure if yes, we do have an explainability problem, but I think we are somewhere in between where doctors know a lot and pharma doesn't, or they don't know any. Okay. Yeah.
So I'm Brian Lynch. I'm one of the graduate students here at Northeastern, coming up to the end of it. My question has to do with the ethics concerning training AI on AI-generated materials. Because as time goes on, we're going to run into the issue of we've trained it on all the publicly available data or even on all the privately available data. Once we start training it on AI-generated data, that changes the game. And is there an ethical implication by needing to avoid that or not?
I just have one quick thing to say, and then that is probably something that I'm, again, private citizen, the most concerned about. I think a lot of people think about AI and they think about like Skynet from Terminator or something, right? Like something becoming self-aware and then like all these bad things happening. What I'm more nervous about in like the 5 to 10 year time frame is like the capacity for human understanding is a flat line, right? Like we've basically been here for a while. Computers are doing the hockey stick thing. It's going to get to a point, and we've seen it with disinformation in the last couple election cycles really clearly, where it's going to be really difficult to discriminate between something that was written by a human and something that came out of a model that was maybe trained on another model, which was trained on another model, which was trained on another model. So now, take that to its conclusion. If the contents of the internet or whatever we're heading toward is like 99% that generated stuff and maybe, you know, like 1% stuff written by people, how does your person of average intelligence, I'm sure everybody in here is, you know, like a super smart person. Congratulations for like being above average intelligence, but like how does somebody of average intelligence sort through that? And like, where are we, as a species? I think we're starting to outsmart ourselves, and we give you the mic now.
Thank you. This whole conversation, it reminds me there's a Carl Sagan quote about, he has this foreboding of a future where lawmakers, regulators don't have the capacity to understand or the education to understand what they're being asked to regulate or to make policy around. And he was writing about this in the 70s. And I think it's actually particularly relevant to state government, especially a state of Maine, like Maine, because we don't have the money to hire people with the technological competency to even ask these questions or regulate them. So we get, at the state level, we have a real problem with, I might go as far as to say, companies that operate on extracting as much money from the public as they can because the state doesn't have any capacity to question that. So I put in a bill last session that very simply would have asked a state agency, actually the Ethics Commission, it was about campaign finance regulation, to ask them to update their website to add this capacity. And our vendor came back and said that was going to cost us $1.5 million. Nobody in the state has any ability to say, well, that's a couple lines of code, that's, this one, that's out there and some forum, we could just copy and paste it and add it. They're telling us it's going to cost us $1.5 million, and nobody at the state level says, I could stand up as an elected guy and say, hey, I don't think that's right, but who's listening to me? So that's a problem. So if you could hear one message from me today as somebody who's, in a public capacity, if you care about our communities, if you want to do some service, you folks could do a lot of service at the public level. Take a low-paying job for a couple of years, and do some service for something like, your community, the state of Maine, the United States, we need folks who are able to ask these questions.
I don't know.
Okay.
Your
Are you
question?
sure? Maybe we have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah, we start late.
Yeah, you got a question for Luke. So I know like Apple is like an international company, right? And yeah, we have customers from like Europe, Asia, like United States, and you're working on Siri. So say like you have data sets for each place, each country, right? Like when you carry an iPhone, like from here and traveling to Europe, because of the regulations and the laws that you mentioned earlier, like because different places have different regulations on ethics. How do you set the limits there? Do you like the Siri, the data set they use by Siri just change it automatically once you arrive there? And like, yeah, I guess my question is like, how do you change the data set? And also, where did you get that Apple Watch band?
Not from Apple. So unfortunately, I can't talk about specifically like technical mechanisms or whatever's going on. I will say that, obviously as a global multinational, and I think the CEO of LLB was saying the same thing, we have to jump through a bunch of different hoops depending on where we're operating, and the definition of where you're operating is interesting, right? If I get on a plane and take my US phone to, let's say, mainland China, it's a whole different ballgame in terms of what I'm allowed to do. That's not an Apple thing. That's a U.S. thing. And so yeah, we have to do some clever things to operate the correct way in whatever jurisdiction we're in. But I think to Rita's point earlier, and this was echoed on the CEO panel too. Usually the smart thing to do from a corporate perspective is to take the most stringent, strictest set of guidelines. Or like in the case of a place like California, you think of California vehicle emission standards, right? Like from there, everything else kind of flowed because, as the world's 7th largest economy or whatever California is, like a lot of people are going to buy cars there. You better make your cars work in California. So see also chargers in Europe and how that's affecting my particular company. So you gotta play ball, and you were saying Brazil and Canada, and everybody's going to have a little bit of a different take on it. I'm sure there'll be some global economic forum around AI ethics and what we should be doing. And hopefully we can converge, but that never happens in practice. These things are messy because people are involved, which is great. But yeah, that's why we have jobs doing this, because there's a lot to do in order to do it the right way.
So apparently, can we get one more question? Let's get one more question.
Thanks. Sorry, this is maybe a little bit silly, might seem a little bit silly, but I think on an AI ethics panel we should maybe just mention the term alignment. So just generally speaking, what's the chance that we all end up paperclips in 50 years?
100%. Can we get the mic? Over. Thank you. So, would you like to?
But I just want to go back to your point real quickly. So the problem is today, what do you think that is great about ChatGPT? Is the fact that it looks like humans, right? Now what we are saying is that it's going to start training over its own production. So over time, there's a chance that it's going to get farther from humans. And then we may get to the point of saying that's worse, because they are training more on their data, so they are getting farther from what we understand as a good human conversation. So just a point for us to consider. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case, but going back to the alignment problem. So the alignment problem is if you have autonomous systems that can decide how to get to a certain objective, how do you make sure that the objective of the autonomous system is aligned to human objectives? That's basically the question, right? And I think that it's a valid question. There are many people working on that. But I think that there's an initial question that we have to answer. How we get the private sector aligned to the common good. That's a basic alignment problem that I think that we haven't been addressing quite well so far.
So I'll end it with following your question actually. So I think the general intelligence, superintelligence question is actually interesting and super important, because even if the probability is low, the risk is amazing, right? Nobody wants to be paperclip, so the risk is amazing. So in that sense, yes, the extinction or the existential risk question must be taken seriously, and I don't think it's a trivial question at all. So that is one problem that we should all be worried about. But the other problem that we are mostly discussing now is the more narrow AI questions, and it is everything that we discussed, the questions around bias, the fairness, explainability, privacy. There is no way that we can solve this as representing our individual sectors. I am working literally at the intersection of the academia, industry, and the public sector, and it is impossible to do any of them, just focus on one of them, because whatever happens in collection. And as I said, with the public-private blurriness, but also academic research going to private and going the other direction. So it has to be somehow, going back to your alignment thing between private sector, we somehow have to find ways of working together and putting in place systems that will function, frameworks, systems that will function seamlessly throughout these sectors. Otherwise, we are going to make sure that we regulate facial recognition and law enforcement, and then your phone is going to send all this information somewhere that you don't want it to be sent. Yeah, but we are running out. We have run out of time. Yeah. Oh, go for it. Why?
One quick comment, which is that it's easier, I think, for the moment for legislatures to think about the consumer impact, to regulate on the basis of consumer harm, the individual human being and how it will affect them. And we've already seen that, as you know. So AI is already regulated to the extent that it collects and manages personal data. But if you think back to the environmental era where we were regulating at the emissions level because it affects everybody, we have a polluted environment. That's another model to consider, which is, hey, before you do something, you have to get permission, you have to get a permit. Do you want to go there where the government is giving permission before there is an action on something that AI may be involved in? There's a lot to talk about. I think just even understanding how to regulate, like what's the best model for regulation, still very much an open question. Okay, that's it.
Grayson, do you want to take the last word or no?
No.
Okay.
All right. I wanted to just express my thanks and gratitude to all of you for joining us today. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. And this has been a fantastic day. And I don't know about all of you, but I could use some refreshments. Please join us in the center of the campus for some refreshments. There are also some really great tables where our partners and other academic partners, so corporate partners, academic partners, and community partners have set up information about how you might engage with them as well. So please join us and continue networking and get to know folks that maybe you didn't know when you walked in today. So thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.